It's so hard to bundle and discount correctly that most of the time it's not being done right.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for in eBay.
I mean, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Jennings Executive Search. I had a great conversation with John Jennings about the skills needed in different pricing roles. He and I think a lot alike. If you're looking for a new pricing role, or if you're trying to hire just the right pricing person, I strongly suggest you reach out to Jennings Executive Search. They specialize in placing pricing people. Say that 3 times fast. Welcome to the Impact Pricing Podcast, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the educated relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and our guest today is Chris Uthe. Here are 3 things you want to know about Chris before we start. He is the Director of Product Management at Ocelot. He's been working in the education market since 2006, both for an educational institution and for companies that sell to education. And he started his first business at the age of 16, and he's only 17 now. Not really. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much, Mark. I am so excited to be here.
So I'm going to ask the question, even though I'm not sure it's relevant. How did you get into pricing? How did you start caring about pricing?
Watching what I thought were foregone conclusions fail in the market, right? Giving a discount not working, not understanding why after years of either giving away or discounting software, we had an unviable software solution, right? Because we had just destroyed the value of the product in everybody's eyes, unknowingly, thinking that we were doing the right thing to get it in their hands, right? So like most people in pricing, you end up there because accidentally, because you're forced into it. What you're doing isn't working. So
yeah, and usually you see that there's a ton of power in making smart pricing decisions. And okay, so now let's make some smart pricing decisions.
Exactly. So
I don't remember exactly how it happened, but we were on LinkedIn and someone had said something about pricing at higher education, and you stuck your hand up and said, "Hey, I know about pricing at higher education." So this is an industry that I find fascinating. A, because I used to be a professor and I lived in that world for a little while, but B, it seems like they don't make logical decisions. And so if our buyers aren't going to make logical decisions, how do we even think about pricing? So I'll let you just riff for a few minutes on what do you think about pricing in higher ed?
It's very interesting. Like you said, a lot of it doesn't seem logical because of the odd inputs on the demand side, right? You've got awkward budgets that are partially publicly funded, partially privately funded. You're fighting internally across departments, which, isn't unusual for regular businesses, but it's a different situation when you come into like grant funding and some of those kinds of things, and suddenly budgets swing wildly, right? And budgets are budgets in education, especially right now, right? We're seeing this very worrying trend of smaller educational institutions running out of those budgets. So budgets are hard, and suddenly you see a wild swing in something like the CARES Act, for instance, right? Suddenly higher education can spend a bunch of money for these specific things. Well, if your particular product fits into one of those areas, suddenly you have a wide open budget market that you didn't have before, right? And everybody's in a hurry to spend the budget. It's the worst kind of budget. It disappears at the end of the year, right? And if you didn't spend it, you don't get it back. It's all of the worst parts of budgeting, combined with all of some very difficult inputs of, our end user or our end customer is a student, right? And what's best for them versus the people that are really knocking on my door might be faculty, might be the staff of the institution, might be the board of the institution. What are we getting for what we're doing, and what's important to everybody, right? The student rarely has a voice there, so it's so difficult to come at these purchasing decisions saying, okay, we have to do only what's best for the student here, because you've got so many competing priorities that are sort of odd for the market, right?
There is so much to unpack in what you just said, but let me start with the question or first a comment. With what you described, it is obvious that there's a huge difference between buyers and users.
Yep.
We often think of students as users. We could think of the instructors or professors as users, admin people as users, and those people are rarely the people who buy, are rarely the people who make the decision. So now the question is, what do institutions of higher education value? So if I were selling to a company, what I'm going to teach them is, hey, here's how you make more profit. And that's easy for me to do, right? I mean, I understand it. But if I walk into a higher education organization, I walk in and say, hey, you can make more profit. They're like, I don't care. What do they care about?
Some would tell you that they don't care. There are a sad few that would tell you they might care a little bit about profit because they do have to pay the bills still. Not all of them are living on generous endowments, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. They care about, hopefully, student success at the end of the day, right? They want to talk to you about placement rate. They want to talk to you about probably, job acceptance rate. They want to talk to you about average salary coming out of school, which I think is a very awkward discussion as well. Because the students' value, I think, in their minds when they talk to you about things like that is, I paid X, Y, or Z to come to school here. I got a great education and I make X, Y, or Z in return, right? The value proposition is, where did I land my career from being here? A lot of ways that.
Those are nice and they feel right. They feel good. But here's the problem. I can measure how much profit I make a company. I can't measure how well someone gets placed, right? Did they get placed higher or lower than they would have had they gone to a different institution? Had they not gone to school, right? So where's the measurement? What's the thing I'm selling them?
That's such a great question. And what makes pricing in higher education so difficult? Because again, we can equate things to time saved, money made, but saying comes back to why, certain industries have very interesting, did you pass this test? Did you get a high score on this test? Did you get placed into a law school? There are some of those pre-med programs where you can have some recognition of some kind of metric, right? But for people that are, my favorite example is a nursing school, right? Nursing schools are popping up all over the place, all sorts of, even small private institutions, faith-based institutions, which are just a weird group of schools, sub 2,000 FTE that are, based in church principles, right? They're bringing on nursing programs because they're wildly successful. We have a lack of nurses and they make a lot of money doing nursing programs.
And they have 100% placement rate afterwards.
Yep, exactly.
And so what's interesting is, let's pick a few metrics for a second. And so let's pick placement rate as a metric. And now if you could truly measure that accurately, then it's really dependent upon what majors you offer. Because some majors, like nursing, I'm going to place 100% of those people. Some majors, I'm not going to be able to place because they really weren't a trade, right? It wasn't teaching you a job. It was just giving you an education.
Yep. Geology
is a great example, right? And so it feels hard to say, look, I'm going to make that a metric. Now, back when I worked with your previous employer, by the way, I worked with them a little bit, and we were always talking about, well, what does this company value? What does this buyer value? One of the things we came up with was, where do they rank on U.S. News and World Report? So what do you think about that?
Well, it's important, actually. It's a measurable aspect, which, anytime we can get something measurable, it's important. Doesn't mean that it's a good measurement, but it is something that we can measure, which is, sort of the point of this conversation we're having. If you can't measure anything, how do you find value, right? I think U.S. News and World Report is an important measuring stick because it starts to quantify public opinion because some of the value, the unspoken value, let me back up. The unspoken value of your degree comes from, or just going to an institution comes from all of the doors that it opens for having it on your resume, right? Like the institution that I went to opens very few doors nationally for me, but locally there are certain business leaders that went there. There are certain that those doors open, right? And that's an intrinsic value of an education. You get all of the alumni and friends, so to speak, in your corner, right? And U.S. News and World Report's list is actually a somewhat useful list of schools that have placed enough people in enough great positions to be impactful, right? It's sort of like an influence index, as annoying as that is, right? It's like having somebody retweet your tweet who happens to have 20 million followers, right? Suddenly you have a little more influence than you did before, right?
Yeah. So now an interesting question, and I don't know if this is fair to ask or not. What if a university or a college could raise their ranking by 2 places on U.S. News and World Report? How much would they pay for that?
Depends on if you're going from the marker 100 to marker 98, or if you're going from marker 52 to 49, or if you're going, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Relative placement there is super important, I think, because the first part of the list, it's, above the fold problem again. But
so pick one, pick any one you want, because I think the answer is the same. Maybe the value is different, but I think the answer is the same.
The value is different. The answer is probably the same, which is they probably wouldn't write that check, right? That's not going to be something that they'd be willing to pay for, even if you could promise it to them.
Yeah, even if they believed it, but yet it's something they value, which is so interesting to me. So interesting. So how do they make these decisions? Maybe I should shift the conversation a little bit. I often think about B2C versus B2B pricing. And
Yes.
in B2B pricing, I almost always come back to economic value. How much profit am I going to make my customer? In B2C, I stop thinking that way and I start thinking, how much do people care about how good they look in a blue shirt? Right? I use a blue shirt all the time because whenever I always taught the first day in a blue shirt. And by the way, I did that because that was the only shirt I ever wore that people would compliment me on. So I always wore it on the first day.
You're making a good impression.
I know, exactly. And so what was that worth to me? And it's hard to quantify. So now do we put higher ed in that same boat? It's hard to quantify, but hey, you look good. You've gotten compliments. I think I'll spend money on a blue shirt.
I put higher ed more in B2C than B2B because the people who are, so you have a hierarchy of people demanding change, right? So the reason they're looking at a piece of software, in my case, right, is something's not happening. We could be doing something better, and usually it's coming from within, right? So somebody in a department is telling somebody else at the department head level, this isn't working. It's rarely ever a CTO that says, hey, I feel like I want to spend some money on a piece of software, right? Even though they're the one making the last choice. So you get this groundswell of need, which is classic for any software purchase. We're not doing this well enough. It's not working as well as it could be. Start looking for solutions. But that person is so close to the consumer, that's the student, right? The reason that they're looking for that is that their end user is running out of success, right? They need value there. So they're really, it almost always starts with a very altruistic need, which I think is amazing in higher ed, because it's our students aren't getting the help they need at the right time, for instance, or these students aren't able to log into the learning management system and do something meaningful at the right time, or they don't know how to do it. They can't get it done. It starts very altruistic, which is one of my favorite parts of higher education, because it does usually come back to making the student more successful. And then it sort of bubbles up, and what it ends up being is, and this is where pricing in higher ed gets so dodgy, is it ends up being a competition of, well, we have to look at least 3 vendors, because that's how the procurement process works. And then if all 3 of them are roughly the same price, then we're going to have a feature battle, because that's the only thing the CTO knows how to do. They're not even in tune with the original need anyway of what was providing value. So now you end up in a world where software companies are pushing feature parity in higher education, as well as pricing parity and pricing competition to try and get this win, even though that's not what the original request was. It morphs as it gets up into the CTO office and the other people that are making these choices.
Yeah, so let's come back to procurement in just a second, because one of the things you said just seemed so interesting to me, and I would rephrase it as the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Yep.
And so the reason I'm going to go spend money on a new piece of software is because I have a bunch of students that are complaining.
Yep.
And that's
typically
just
or a bunch of faculty that are hearing about it.
Yeah. And what I find fascinating about that is most of us only go to school once. Sadly, I've been to school way too many times, but most of us only go to school once. And so you don't know what you're missing out on. But I would guess that a lot of students, when they start to use old user interfaces and they're used to using their smartphone and they know what's possible and playing games, now they start to complain and say, hey, look, this is possible everywhere, but not here in my university. Come on, let's go get that fixed. So I could see how that could drive demand. So, I just find that really fascinating. Let's jump to procurement for a second then. When companies, including universities, want to buy something, we often put together an RFP process. And we put together this RFP process because we want to make sure we're making a rational decision. We want to make sure that no one's being bribed or no one's buying from their best friend. But what I find fascinating about that is to put together an RFP, it typically assumes that you already know the solution to the problem.
Or you know what the problem is even.
Yeah, it would be much more interesting to write an RFP around what is the problem, right? So here's the problem we're trying to solve. Now, how would you go solve it? And so now your RFPs aren't even similar. They shouldn't be similar from different vendors.
Yeah, it gets down to, and this is one of the things that as a
non-salesperson,
as a product person, it gets down to what we talk about, internally as well, is that's great that they asked you to show them this widget and these 5 clicks, but did you ask them why they needed it? Because we solve it in a different way, or we solve it better because we do it this way, right? Those preconceived notions are so difficult to overcome in an RFP process, partly because sometimes you don't have the right stakeholders, right? You're not RFPing in front of students, although I have done that. I've been in part of a demo for where our software was up against other pieces of software, and the people in the demo were students, and the university was gathering feedback from the students as part of the demo, which made me so happy to see. But that's almost never the case, right? It's somebody else who assumes that they understand the problem, and they probably have an idea of how they would like to see it tackled. Maybe they've seen it in a different piece of software. Worst case scenario, they had software that did it before and they loved it, right? And so they're coming in with all of these solutions instead of problems, like you said, and it makes the sales process extremely difficult, especially if there's a disparity in price, and you're trying to prove value out when they've got a preconceived notion about what they need, right?
Yeah, and what's fascinating about that is when they ask us for solutions, what it really says is that they've already designed a solution, and yet your company does this for a living. You study the problems, you study the possible solutions. Wouldn't it make sense that your company or other companies could solve the problem better than their internal people could solve the problem?
Yeah, it speaks to, if you look at some of the most successful, getting a little off track, if you look at some of the most successful companies, they're solving problems that people hadn't yet digested, right? Facebook solved a problem that nobody knew existed. So there was no preconceived notion about how that should work. You can solve the problem to the best of its ability and find success without, being muddied down in the way that we've always done it. Look at what the automotive industry is going through right now as we transition from fossil fuels to batteries. We have this preconceived notion about how a car should work. I should be able to stop and fill my car up in 5 minutes, right, at the gas station. If the first car that came out, solved the electric car before we got to the gas car, it'd be a much easier discussion, right? So it's getting over those preconceived problem solution sets is a big challenge, especially in higher education, because they've been doing it. You're literally selling to people who wrote the book on whatever subject they're in. It's like me having a conversation with you about pricing and value. It's difficult to even consider the idea that you're going to sort of move the needle for them. They're coming in going, I've got 2 PhDs and I'm teaching, all of these classes. I understand how I want this to work, right? So it's interesting to try and get through that process.
Yeah, it's interesting to see if people could be open-minded. But then again, we're back to the reason we do RFPs is we don't want to get cheated or make a mistake. And the act of doing the RFP actually binds our hands and makes it so we don't make smart decisions. We can't make optimal decisions.
We lose sight of the possibility of a better solution.
Yeah, which is absolutely fascinating. Chris, I have so enjoyed talking with you about this. It's a field that I still don't understand. Sorry you didn't clarify it well enough for me. I'm not sure if it's possible, but let me ask you the final question. What's one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Don't bundle, don't discount.
Wow. Okay. Go ahead and elaborate a little bit on that for me, because I would typically disagree with those things, but go ahead. Let's see what you're thinking.
I know you do. I've read your because it's so often executed so poorly and as a desperation move instead of how it should be used. It's so hard to bundle and discount correctly that most of the time it's not being done right. The risk to the value of the perceived value of your product is so great that it's not worth doing it wrong. When you bundle a piece of software with another piece of software, especially, what you're saying is this software has no value because I'm giving it to you for free. And when you discount a piece of software deeply, what you're saying is we don't know what the value of our software is, and we don't know how to convey that to you because we don't know what price to tell you. If I see another RFP that says, if you sign by this date, we'll give you a 5% discount. If you sign by that date, we'll give you a 10% discount. The software has not lost value if they wait 35 days versus 30, right? What kind of message are you sending? You're doing damage to the perceived value of your product. And you can do it correctly. Obviously, you're a big proponent of that. And I've enjoyed all the things that you've said about it. It's just you see it done wrong too much to justify trying to do it, in my opinion. You know what your product's worth, price it accordingly, and stick to it.
Okay, I'm going to say what you just said, but I'm going to use different words if that's okay. What you said was don't bundle or don't discount unless you truly know what you're doing.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll buy that, because then
that's a better way to say it, for
sure. All right, Chris, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
LinkedIn, just search for Chris Uthe, Uthe, and I'm there.
Awesome. And there'll be a link in the show notes as well. Episode 180 is all done. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? Also, please tell your pricing colleagues about this podcast. I hear from a lot of people new in pricing that they find this invaluable. And finally, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact. Thanks again to Jennings Executive Search for sponsoring our podcast. If you're looking to hire someone in pricing, I suggest you contact someone who knows pricing people. Contact Jennings Executive Search.